Hello everyone. In this chapter, we are going to continue our discussion on network security and also we'll talk about network management. So we'll talk a little bit more about the target breach case that we talked about last time, and then we'll provide a little bit more details. And then we'll talk about the cost of network management and also its roles in network security. And then we'll talk about network quality of service or QoS, so what it means and why we need that. And then we'll talk about some basic principles of network design. And then we'll also talk about some principles of security planning. And finally, we'll talk about centralized management for network. So last time we talked about the failure case in target breach. So we know they leak out their information because the POS system that they used was hacked by the hackers through their one of their vendors called this facial engineering services. So actually one of the lessons learned in the case is that security is actually a process. It's not just a product. That means if you just have the antivirus product or you just have a good network firewall, it's going to help with your security, but it's not enough, right? It's actually very important to you to really look at the overall process, how you are doing things in your organization, how people are using your networks, and also like whether you have a good process in practice to ensure that your network is secure. So in a target case, the vendor facial engineering actually is a contractor that Target is working with, but this contractor had very weak security. So basically, one employee of this company fell for spear phishing attack and then gave access to the vendor server. And then Facio actually used a free antivirus program. So and this program is more kind of like for personal use, but not for corporation. So the security level is not strong enough. And also this antivirus program did not give any warning for the individual messages. So that's why the phishing attack was successful. So another problem in the tag case was that the hacker's program was able to move to the sensitive servers from the vendor's server, right? So actually it should not happen because if you have better security, then your sensitive servers also should have better firewall and also better protection. And another very important process is that um another very important problems in this case is that actually the employees in Target ignore the warnings. So there was a lot of warning actually from the FireEye IDS service. So that's the firewall service that they use. And actually the IDS is the intrusion detection system that they use for the protection. And there were many warnings actually generated from this protection system. So on November 30th, December 1st and 3rd, there were a lot of warnings. But then all these warnings actually were ignored by the employees. A lot of times people did not pay attention because when there were too many warnings, actually people just ignore, saying, "Oh, the system is just making some false alarms," and then you just didn't pay attention. But actually, the exfiltration that is the um kind of uploading of the or the export of the data from Target actually began on December 2nd. So if the employees of Target were able to stop, or at least if they were able to spot the problem before December 2nd, then the damage would have been really small or even non-existent, right, if they pay attention to these warnings. In network security, there is a concept called kill chain analysis. So for a weapon to succeed, a number of steps must go correctly. Just like what we are showing in this diagram, you have to define a target, find and organize accomplices, build or acquire tools, research the target, infrastructure, and also the employees, test for detection, deployment, Then you have initial intrusion, outbound connection initiated, expand access and obtain the credentials, strengthen the foothold, exfiltrate your data, also cover tracks and remain undetected. So that's kind of the overall kill chain, right? So you actually need to go to at least say this step in order to like get the data, like in this case the credit card data and also other information of the customers. So if you fail in one of the previous steps, then the attack would fail. So this is what is called the kill chain, and then we actually as like if you are a security expert, then what you need to do is to do the kill chain analysis, and then you try to protect your system from the possible attacks related to all these steps. So companies must look for evidence of kill chain patterns and end the chain before the end. Right? So if there are any patterns that actually shows possible hacking activities in the kill chain, then you should be able to spot it and then try to stop it. But of course, in this case, Target did not. Actually, the a company here had quite a few opportunities to stop the kill chain, but of course, as we have looked at, they failed. Right? So companies should actively consider security kill chains and also look for evidence that one of the steps is occurring. If there are any abnormal behaviors happening in your network, just we need to be very careful. Then we'll talk about the cost in network management. Nowadays, we can build very large networks, and actually, it's usually easier to build large networks than we can manage. So, also, network devices and their users are often scattered over large regions. So, it's actually sometimes difficult for you to physically visit all of these users and devices, right? If they are scattered over different places. So, network actually needs active management. So this diagram is showing the relationship between the kind of user demand and also the money that you have over time. So people have analyzed and found user demand is growing much faster than the network budgets. So people are increasingly requiring more usage of the network. For example, more services, better services, higher quality. Of course, we know it. Due to COVID-19, then suddenly people's demand of network increased a lot because people started to work from home and also started to attend classes on Zoom and so on. Right, but normally the budget is not growing as much because companies usually try to save money and try to not invest a lot on IT. Right? So that's why cost efficiency is always critical. So we will try to achieve better services and higher quality with limited money. So we'll talk about network quality of service, QoS. So quality of service metrics include speed, like transmission speed usually measured in bits per second, BPS. Or of course it can be like higher units like Mbps, right, megabit per second, or even gigabit per second. So this is usually something that we talk about. But then besides speed, then we also need to pay attention to other metrics like errors. So what is the percentage of incorrect bits or packets? If you have very high speed but your error rate is very high, then it's not going to be useful. And also the other one is availability, is the percentage of time the network is available to users. So are you going to guarantee that your network will be available like for say 99% of the time? So if 99% of the time, is it good or not? So of course, in terms of network standard, it's 99% of availability. Although it sounds good, right? It's close to 100%. Actually, it's not that good because if you think about it, 99% of 365 days in a year, then that means you have 3.6 days that the network is down, right? every year. So if you think about your home network or think about the campus network, you won't be able to you won't be happy, right? If you won't be able to get online for 3.6 days every year, right? So you normally network availability, we need to have higher percentage, 99.99% or something like that. So normally like the downtime in a year should be maybe just a few hours. Um, and then another metric is latency. So it's a time delay in packet delivery measured in milliseconds. So speed is different from latency, right? You can still have a very high speed, but then the latency can still be delayed, right? That means you can have like 100 megabit per second arriving at your computer. So you can still download a file, like you can still download say 100 megabit um of data, right? Every second. So that's a speed you have. But then it does not say whether you are getting the data say after 1 second or after 10 seconds or after 1 minute, right? So that's the latency, right? Usually measured in milliseconds. So when we talk about network speed, there are two related concepts. One is the rated speed. So this is the speed that a system should achieve in the best case. So it's usually according to the vendor claims or to the standard that defines the technology. So different standard, they have the kind of supposed speed that the standard is going to achieve. Then another concept is the throughput. So the throughput is the actual speed. So it's the data transmission speed that system actually provides to users. So it's kind of like when you um kind of have a subscription to a say broadband service, right? Then they tell you the speed is going to be 100 megabit per second, right? So you have that service that you sign the contract for 100 meg, right? Then this one is the rated speed. But when you are actually using the system, like you normally you don't achieve the full 100 megabit per second. You may be getting like 80 megabit per second or something like that. So that's the actual speed you are getting, and that's what we call the throughput. Then when we talk about the throughput, we also have the aggregate versus rated throughput on shared lines. The aggregate throughput is the total throughput available to all users in part of a network. So sometimes you will be sharing the same network. Most obviously, like when you are sharing a Wi-Fi network, right? Then the aggregate throughput is the throughput of all the users added together. And then the individual throughput is the one that is an individual's share of the aggregate throughput. So it's only the part of an individual user. Right? The Wi-Fi may be supporting 100 megabit per second at most, but then if you have 10 users using it at the same time, then each of the users may only get like roughly around 10 megabit per second and probably lower than that. So this is just a quick diagram showing the rated speed is kind of the largest, right? So it may be 100 megabit per second. And then the aggregate throughput shared by all users may be just around 80, 90 megabit per second, right? Due to various reasons. So there is a loss of the speed. And then the individual throughput there will be even smaller, right? Because you have multiple users sharing the same transmission media. So just a quick chat on the speed, right? Some questions to test your knowledge. So if you are in a Wi-Fi hotspot with 20 other people, the access point router is rated as following the 802.11 AC standard, which we will talk about in later chapter. So basically the AC Wi-Fi standard with options of providing 300 megabit per second. Throughput is about 50% only, right? Wi-Fi normally the speed is not the perfect speed. You have lower speed, right? So at a certain moment, say suppose you are and four other users are sending and receiving, then what individual throughput are you likely to receive if every one of you are basically using the data actively, then what is the throughput that you can get, right? So in this case, it will be, right. So you have 300 as your rated speed, but throughput is only 50%, so it's half of 300, so it's 150, and then share by 5 people together. So each person will only get around 30 megabit per second. So just a second example, say in the coffee shop, then there are 10 people sharing an access point with a rated speed of 20 megabit per second. Then the throughput is half the rated speed, and several people are downloading, and each is getting 5 megabit per second. Then just say how many people are using the internet at the moment. So the rated speed is 20, and the throughput is just half, so it's just 10. So each person is getting 5 megabit per second. So then you guess maybe really around 2 people are downloading, right? Because other people might be connected to the access point, but they may not be downloading like a lot. They may just be using it like with very small download of data, right? So then you can get roughly maybe 2 people are really downloading the file, right? At the same time. So that's something that you can kind of guess from the data provided. Okay, so let's talk about availability and error rates. So availability is the percentage of time that the network is available for use. As we said, usually it has to be a very high percentage that is um close to 100%. So again, 99% would not be enough normally. You need to have something more than that. So and the error rate is the percentage of bits or packets that are lost or damaged during delivery. So sometimes the impact of small errors could be large, right? Because as I say, if the this was diagram is showing again the TCP process. So if you are opening a connection, then if you have an error during the opening of connection, that's okay because you are not sending a large chunk of data. Right? But then when you are sending a large chunk of data, right, then if there is an error, then you need to resend the whole thing. You need to resend the whole packet, so that then the cost will be much higher. When packets are received in the network, they will encounter some delays, and then this amount of delay is called latency, as we said, usually is measured in milliseconds. So there is a related concept called jitter. So jitter is the variability in latency. So normally if the latency is constant like this, then the problem is not very large. Then your kind of the recipient will be able to handle the data, right? Because we know the latency is constant, right? So we just kind of plan for that. But then if the jittering is high like this, there is a high variability in latency. So you may be receiving some data packets very quickly, but then there are some delay in the middle, right? And then again after this delay, then the packets kind of come together, and then there's little latency. So that means there is a high variability there. Then you may be hearing things like this. I know some of you might have that experience when you are watching something online, then suddenly you got no voice and you got no sound and no video, and suddenly all the sound come together and all the videos come together at a very fast speed. Here is an example of latency and jitter. So suppose we have collected 5 samples with the following latencies, again in milliseconds: 136, 184, 115, 148, and 125. Then what's the average latency? Then you just add the 5 numbers together: 136 plus 184 plus 115 plus 148 plus 125 divided by 5. Then that would be your latency, right? Or average latency. Then how do we calculate this jitter? Then we actually need to look at the variations, right? So we look at their differences. For example, this one between 136 and 184, then the difference is like 48, right? And then you look at say between 184 and 115, then the difference is 69, right? And then you look at the difference between these two, then that's 33. And then you also look at the difference between this 148 and 125, then the difference is 23. Then you take these four differences and divide by 4, then that's your jitter. So that's how you calculate the average latency and the jitter of your network connection. When we subscribe to a network service, we need to pay attention to the service level agreements. So that's the guarantee for the performance. And then normally there will be some penalties. For example, they may waive your fee or give you a discount if the network does not meet its service metrics guarantees. So normally the guarantees would specify the worst case scenario. That means for example, it will provide a lower speed that is, for example, no worse than 1 megabit per second. And then they will also guarantee kind of a maximum latency, say no more than 125 milliseconds. And then service level agreements are kind of like insurance policies that you at least have this service. So normally it is written on a percentage basis. For example, we say no worse than 100 megabit per second 99.5% of the time. Right? So because as the percentage increases, then additional engineering raises network costs. Now, of course, 100% compliance will be prohibitively expensive. So like if you try to as you said, like give some like maintain a network or maintain a computer is running, right? Then if I say 99% of the time, normally it's not too hard. Right? Say if you have, again, give you 365 days, then 1% is 3.6 days. Then if you have 3.6 days for maintenance or for some unexpected errors, then you still have like a lot of time to fix it, right? Even if there's any breakdown, if you want to fix the network, then you fix it. Like you have a lot of time to fix it. But if you change it to a much higher percentage, right, 99.9%, right, that what you can do is only like 0.36 days for you to fix any errors, right? So it's basically just around 10 hours of downtime every year. Right, that means for any of the maintenance or any problems, you need to fix it like within a few hours, right? Otherwise, like then it will not be giving the service. Now, of course, like um with 10 hours downtime, then maybe for personal usage at home is acceptable, right, per year, right? Sometimes you have some unexpected problem, but say for organization, again, that may be crucial. Again, if you are running a large e-commerce site, any downtime will mean customers will be turning away, and also like you may have um like a lot of, you may be losing a lot of business because people could not buy from your websites, right? So this kind of downtime then would be very expensive. Then you if you want to push it even higher, like you want to do 100%, then of course it will be much more expensive because 100% normally is very difficult because you need to have maintenance and also some unexpected um issues, right? So if you want to have 100%, then you probably need to have backup, right? You have multiple lines instead of just one line, and these lines probably have to go through different network devices, go through different rules to ensure like the reliability. So that's why 100% of the kind of availability of the network is very expensive. So normally they will guarantee you like 99.5% or 99% of the time, right? Depending on how much you are paid. So the metrics that define levels of service for an ISP, again, ISP is the internet service provider, usually should aim to guarantee the following points, right? So it will be a description of the service being provided, and what is the expected, or actually it should be the worst case scenario, like including what's the reliability in terms of the percentage usually, what is the responsiveness, what is the procedure for reporting problems, should you call them or how do you look for them, to report any problems, whether there's any monitoring and reporting of the service level and how this should be done. Also the consequences for not meeting service obligations. So if they are not meeting these agreements, are they going to give you a discount or even a penalty, or are they going to cover your loss, have a percentage of your loss or something like that? Also whether there are any escape clauses or constraints, or there are any cases where they do not cover, right? For example, if the service disruption is due to natural disaster, then they are not going to cover or something like that. So they can specify all these in detail in the service level agreements. So this of course very important, especially um, an organization is subscribing for an internet service, right? So it's different from individual, right? For organization, so they in the future, if you work as a network administrator for, or kind of like you work as a representative of an organization, then when you go through this kind of documents, then you need to be very careful, like regarding what kind of service level agreements are being provided by the ISP. So residential services are rarely sold with this kind of guarantees, because it would be very expensive for the companies, for the service providers to engineer the network for high percentage guarantees for residential customers. Because normally they just charge you like $100, $200 per month, right? So it would be very expensive for them to guarantee a minimum level that is useful. But sometimes, of course, they will still have some sort of like guarantee, right? That they will try to provide you. But of course, that kind of guarantee is rather like bottom line, that is like something like they could provide. But normally they may do it for the speed, but they may not do it for the like availability that we talk about. So businesses, as you said, like usually they will require high percentage guarantees, and then they are willing to pay higher prices. And so that's why usually these kind of agreements are usually applicable to businesses, but not too much to individuals. Now we'll go into the topic of network design, and then we'll talk about some of the issues related and also some examples. Let's first look at this two-side traffic analysis. Suppose our organization have two sides. One is the headquarter, maybe this one is a branch, and then like normally that's you need to send a lot of data from site A to B and also from site B to A, and then you want to have a 100 megabit per second for the connection from A to B, and then 100 gigabit per second for the connection from site B to A. So that's kind of based on the data that you need to send every day, right? So it could be like a connection from a POS system to the headquarter, or some other source of data transfer between two sites and so on. So if you have this kind of requirement, then you will know, like because like out of these two requirements, I know I will need 1 gigabit per second transmission line, right? Because if you only have 100 megabit per second, it's not going to satisfy this one, right? So the speed requirement may be different in two directions. So normally the transmission lines nowadays are symmetric in speed, but of course in a lot of cases that you have the difference in the upload and download speed, right? If you are using some sort of connections, right, like ADSL and so on. So that's why some sort of in some cases, then you basically use the one with the highest speed. If you are not talking about this kind of upload and download speed difference when you deal with like the internet, right? When you go to websites and also using specific type of services. So this one is a analysis of free site traffic. So here suppose you have an XYZ office at Central, and then this one is another headquarters at ICC, in the Kowloon side, and this one is a data center on Atlanta Island, right? Then you have this connection between Q and R, and this connection between R and S. So then you may have a setting like this. You have the three sites connected by two links. Then you look at the speed requirement, right? After your analysis of the business and the data, you find the speed requirement between Q and R should be 45 megabit per second, and then between R and S is 2 gigabit per second. And there's also transmission between Q and S, right? There's 300 megabit per second that will go through R. Right? So the link QR must carry the traffic flowing between Q and R, and also the traffic flowing between R and S, right? Because for this link, the link QR, there's the traffic here that Q is sending to R, or the other way, right? But then there's also the traffic that is Q is sending to S through R, right? So that means in total, if you look at this diagram, you will see the link QR will need to have a speed of 345 megabit per second in total. And then the link RS will need to have the speed of 2.3 gigabit per second. Right, so this one is just a diagram showing the summation of these two, like 345. And this one, as we said, will be 2.3 gigabit per second, right? 1 gigabit is 1000 megabits, right? So 2.3 gigabit per second. So transaction links sometimes fail. So you want to guarantee or at least have a much higher availability for your link, then what you can do is you have some redundant transmission capacity. So that is extra transmission capacity on links that is normally not needed, but will be needed if other link fails. For example, what you can do is you can have this kind of connection, right? So each pair of sites is connected using this instead of using two lines, like just between Q and R and R and S. What we are going to do here is we have three lines. So we also have a line from Q to S, right? So each pair of sites is connected and each line is only carrying the traffic between the site pairs. So between Q and S, you only have this, you only need the capacity of 300 megabit per second. And between QR, there is 45. Between RS, there is 2 gigabit per second. So a good thing about this is when, say, any of the line is not working, if the line QR is not working, then Q will still be able to send data to R through S, right? So you can go through this line. Then of course, you one line is down, then the overall speed may be reduced, but the good thing is it's still working. At least you can still send data. If you only have two lines, then there's no redundancy, and if any one of the lines is not working, then your whole net then you cannot say you cannot send data between those two sites. So again, if as we have already mentioned, if this line is not working, you can still send traffic from Q to R through S. So if you want to maintain the same speed even when one of the line is not working, then you need to do that calculation of, say, for example, if line 2 is not working, then if I still want to maintain the same speed, then this one will need an extra 45 megabit per second, right, for line 1, because normally it needs to carry 300 megabit per second, but now we have 45 meg more, so you sum them up, right? And this one is the same, like 2 gig plus 45 meg, then you have 2.045 gig, right? But then that's only for one scenario when line 2 is down. So next we'll look at what happens if line 3 is down. So when line 3 is down, then how can traffic get from R to S? So again, then it will need to go through this site, go through this line, right? Line 2 and then line 1 to site S. But of course, the capacity of line 2 is very low. Again, if you want to maintain the same speed, then what you need to do is you actually need to add 2 gigabits here, right? And also 2 gigabits here. Right? So this will become 2.3 megabit per second. Sorry, gigabit per second. And this will become 2.045 megabit per second, right? So basically what you are doing is you need to have really around 2 gigabit per second, right? Actually more than 2 gigabit per second for each of this line. It will be you have like 2.3 megabit per second for this line, right? If you, and also for this line, right? If you want to maintain the same speed, right? Even when this line is down. So normally network capacity is higher than the traffic. So again, for example, for your network subscription at home, right? You may be having 100 megabit per second or even 1 gigabit per second. But normally you don't use it all the time, right? You only use it a lot. Let's say, for example, when you are downloading a movie or when you are using a Zoom meeting. Even Zoom meeting actually is not using that much network. But say if you are downloading a lot of things, then at that particular time frame, then you may be using a lot of the traffic. But then most of the time, like you are not using your 1 gigabit per second, right? If you are downloading so much data every second, your hard disk will be full very quickly. Right? So normally you don't use that full capacity most of the time. In fact, a lot of time you are just using a little bit of that capacity. Right? So that's why normally you say your capacity is much higher than the traffic. Sometimes, however, there will be momentary traffic peaks above the network's capacity, usually for a fraction of a second to a few seconds, right? So, as you said, normally it's not very high, but sometimes then suddenly if you really need to download a lot of data, you have a lot of traffic going on, then you may actually go beyond your network capacity. So this is actually more easy to explain. Like if we're talking about some of the share capacity, right? For example, the broadband network that you use at home. Actually, like if you think about the data line going into your building, and that capacity actually is shared by like all the people in that building, right? And suddenly if everyone is trying to download some data, right? Maybe they are all trying to watch a movie on Netflix and so on, right? Then the traffic will be higher than the capacity, right? So that this is kind of the traffic peaks, and sometimes these traffic peak are momentary, right? Then suddenly maybe a lot of people are using, then there will be some congestion of the packets, and then there will be a higher latency. So congestion causes latency because switches and routers must store frames and packets while waiting to send them out again. Because if you cannot send out all the data as you are reaching the limit of the transmission media, then actually you have to wait, right? And then your routers and switches need to hold the frames and packets. Uh, so after holding too many packets, then actually because the buffers are limited, the buffer size of a router, for example, is limited. Then if I'm waiting I'm receiving so much traffic coming in, but I do not have the capacity to send them out yet, then I need to store them in the buffer. But even when the buffer is full, right, um, then all the remaining packets coming in will be dropped, right? So because the router cannot hold them anymore. So when that happens, then some packets may be lost. One way to address momentary traffic peaks is over-provisioning, that is, to provide far more capacity than the network normally needs. So even if there is a peak here, then because your capacity is much higher, so there's no problem, so there will be no congestion. So when you over provision enough, then of course it will avoid nearly all momentary traffic peaks. But it will be wasteful of the transmission line capacity. So with priority latency intolerant traffic such as voice is usually given higher priority and will go first. So that means your router or the service provider devices, they will look at what type of traffic it is, and then you give priority to some traffic that is what we call latency intolerant. So for example, again, voice, then if the voice is delayed for too long, then it will be a problem. So latency tolerant traffic such as email or like web pages, then they can wait for a little longer, right? So if you do this, then hopefully then you can satisfy the needs for users of different applications. Then normally is more efficient than over provisioning because you are not wasting the network capacity. But then of course when you are doing this, is more labor intensive. That means of course it's not like human labor, but we are talking about the work of your network devices, right? Then they need to check the traffic and, and check the packets and see whether they are for voice or for emails, right? Then there will be more work. QoS guarantees reserve capacity for some traffic, so this traffic always gets through. So some QoS actually will guarantee what kind of traffic will have a reserve capacity. So at least say 80% of the traffic must be used for the say data transfer between two sites, for example. Then if you have this kind of guarantee, then again you can program that in your network devices and then make sure that the traffic that are for this particular purpose must always get through. Then other traffic then must fight for the remaining capacity if you have this kind of guarantee. Next, we will talk about some major network security planning principles. So network is facing this kind of threat environment. So that include the possible or potential attacks and the attackers. Then based on that, we need to see how we do the planning and also do the protection of the networks and the system and also how to respond. So you cannot defend yourself unless you know the threat environment you face. Right? So we need to understand the attacks and attackers that we also briefly talked about in the previous chapter. So companies defend themselves with a process called the plan, protect, response cycle. So the cycle starts with planning. So we'll look at the important planning principles like risk analysis, comprehensive security, defense in depth, and also minimum permissions. Companies also spend most of their security effort on the protection phase, in which they apply planned protections on a daily basis. So we are basically talk about that in chapter 3 about like access control, firewalls, cryptography, also like antivirus software and so on. Even with great planning and protection, incidents will happen, and the company must have a well-rehearsed plan for responding to them. So if something happens, how you are going to respond to that. So for example, like, again in the target case, if something happens, if there are some warning messages, how are you going to deal with that? What's the procedure? So we need to set up like good procedures for handling this. Or of course, like if um even worse, I am going to target case at the time where all the a lot of customer information was leaked, then what will you do, right? So you actually need to think about like what happened like when different incidents um happen and what you are going to do, how you are going to respond. So security is actually a management issue. Again, it's not just a technology issue. Right? So we need to actually do very good security planning in order to make sure our network is safe. So without good management, technology cannot be effective, even if you have the best lock in the world. But you always forget to put the lock on, and then it's not going to be useful. So a company must have good security processes. So again, these are some of the good security planning principles: risk analysis, comprehensive security, defense in depth, weakest link analysis, single points of takeover, least permissions in access control. So we will talk about this in more details in the next several slides. So for risk analysis, the goal is actually not to eliminate all risk. Like risk will always be there, right? It's impossible to eliminate all of them. So we will not pay $1 million for countermeasure to protect assets costing $10, right? So you will not buy a lock for a very expensive lock to lock up something that is actually not expensive, right? So you should reduce risk to the degree that it is economically reasonable. So you must also compare countermeasure benefits with countermeasure costs. So risk analysis actually is the process of balancing risk and also your protection costs. Right? If you are dealing with very sensitive information, right, then you need to have better protection. If you are dealing with some files that you think they are not so important, right, then maybe you just have the minimum protection, and that would be enough. So this one is an example of doing a risk analysis calculation. So suppose you estimated the damage per your successful attack will be $1 million. Right? The annual probability of a successful attack is 20%. Then the annual probability of damage, then you just multiply these two, then it is $200,000. Right? It's kind of the expected value of your damage. Then the cost of countermeasures. So suppose if you are not using any protection, right? Then it will be $0, right? Then that your net annual probable outlay will be $200,000. Of course, if you are not protecting at all, then your estimated annual loss will be $200,000. So suppose we have two countermeasures A and B, right? So this countermeasure could be an intrusion detection system, for example. Say if you are using this system or this countermeasure, so suppose you can reduce the damage from $1 million to $500,000. So it's not going to remove the risk, but then at least it's going to reduce your estimated damage per successful attack. Right? You can for example reduce the downtime from 10 hours to 5 hours, and that will save you some money, just for example. Then it will cut the damage per successful attack in half, but does not change the probability of occurrence. As we say, if you do this, then the probability of or expected value of the damage is $100,000. So you reduce that by half. Then you look at the cost of this countermeasure. Again, it can be an intrusion detection system, right, or some other services provided by security firms. They say this one is the cost is just $20,000. Right. Then your annual cost, right, will be reduced from $200,000 to $120,000. So in that case, then the extra value provided by this countermeasure is actually $80,000. Right? So you save $80,000. Right. So then this countermeasure you should use it, right, because it is going to give you some saving per year. So now looks at countermeasure B. So it will cut the frequency of occurrence, but it does not change the damage per occurrence. So you will cut the probability from 20% to 15%. Right? But if that happens, then your damage per attack is still $1 million. Then again, you can do the calculation, right? Then the expected cost that you need to pay because of this possible attack, then it will be $150,000. So suppose this countermeasure, right, again, some service provided by another security firm or another software, then this one is $60,000. Then you will add these two together, then your net cost, right, it will be $210,000. Actually, this one is even higher than your this is higher than your damage, right, without using the software, right, or the total cost without using the software. Then if you use this, then you compare the two, then this will be a loss of $10,000. And in this case, actually, you will not use countermeasure B. So that's why we are not going to say we are using every possible means to stop the attack. We actually need to look at the cost. If it's too expensive, then we may not use it. Or if it has other hidden costs, right, then we may not use it. So this one is another example. Suppose now we have a countermeasure C. So what it's going to do is it can reduce the damage from $1 million to $800,000 and also reduce the probability to 10%. Then are we going to use this? Then we have to do the calculation. So in this case, the actually expected cost of the attack will be $800,000 times 10%. Then it will be $80,000. And suppose this countermeasure is also $80,000. Then in that case, the net annual probable outlay will be $0. Right? So you actually do not have extra saving for this countermeasure. But in this case, then do you want to adopt the countermeasure? Then probably still yes, right? Because when you use this, you still reduce your probability of the attack. It will save you from a lot of hassles, right? Even if you are not having a really positive saving there, but still as long as you are not losing money, then it may be good to use it. So we'll talk about another concept called the comprehensive security. So that means we want to close all avenues of attack. So suppose this one is a building, right? Then people actually can attack your building from different ways, from different doors, right? Then of course what we want to do is we want to make sure all the doors are secure. You are not putting heavy lock on free doors, and then you just leave the back door open without lock, right? And then all the locks on the other doors are not useful. So that's what we call comprehensive security. Another concept is defense in depth. So that means you have several countermeasures arranged in a series. The attack is stopped if any countermeasure succeeds. So again, going back to our kind of the house analogy in the previous slides, if you have not only one door, you have multiple doors at every entrance, then that's kind of the defense in depth. Now a lot of kind of residential units in Hong Kong are like that. You first have a metal gate, and then you have a wooden door, right? So that's actually two levels of defense. You need two keys, right, in order to open the locks, open the door. Sometimes you need to have even more than two keys, right? So that's a defense in depth. So this is different from the comprehensive security. Comprehensive security is about you close all the entrance, right? You make sure you have security at all the entrances. But this one, defense in depth, is for each entrance you have multiple measures, like countermeasures. Right, so in network, then this one is kind of like when there's an attack to your network, then you have different countermeasures. Like first you have a border firewall. If it fails to stop the attack, then you also may have a host firewall. So you may have a firewall software on your computer, right? So that may be able to successfully stop the attack. And nowadays, many like standalone computers, right, also have the firewalls, right? For example, if you are using Windows 10, then it already has the firewall that is at the host level, right? So even if the network level firewall did not stop the attack, then your host level firewall may be able to stop the attack. Then you may still have like additional lines of defense on the host, right? You can have antivirus software, and also you may have already patched some of the vulnerabilities based on software using software updates. Also, even if they get control to your computer, if your data is encrypted, then even the hackers control your computer, they cannot get your confidential information. So when we do our analysis of a network, we want to identify the weakest links because your network security usually is as weak as the weakest link. Right? Once your weakest link is compromised, then people might be able to get access to your whole network. So we need to analyze all our countermeasures, like again, like firewall hardware, software, also um your log file, and also you need to read your log file frequently, right? Then if there is a defective firewall access control list, right, then actually all these other like say the hardware, software, and also log file may not be able to find that out, right? So if this one is compromised, then even if you are doing the others correctly, the other steps correctly, you may still not be able to like find out the attack. Right? So normally a single countermeasure with multiple components, then you need to identify which one is the weakest. Like all components must work or must all work together and work correctly. Otherwise, an attack will succeed. So this one is what we call the weakest link, and then we need a lot of times we need to do the weakest link analysis to find out which one is the weakest link. So this is a comparison between two similar concepts that we talk about, weakest link and defense in depth. Now, when we talk about defense in depth, then again what we do is we actually are talking about several different countermeasures working together, right? And then the criterion is at least one of them must succeed. If one of them succeed, then you could stop the attack. And then normally when we talk about weakest link, we are talking about one particular component, right? And then the criteria is all components actually must succeed in order for the countermeasure to work. Otherwise, if any of these, like the access control list is compromised, then your the whole firewall is not working. Right? So that's the weakest link. Right, so we also need to protect our network from single points of takeover. So central control is crucial to reducing labor costs and implementation speed. A lot of time, like you actually have got this central control to different network devices, like different firewalls, right? So if, for example, if you want to update the software on your firewall, you just do the update through your control, uh, so through your what we call the firewall control server. Now, of course, like we need to um protect this server very carefully. The reason is that if people get access to one of the firewall computer, right, then the hacker will only get access to this one firewall, right? But if someone got control of this firewall control server, then this hacker will have control of all your firewalls. So we need to be very careful of this kind of what we call single point of takeover. Just like again going back to the target case, what happens was the hackers actually took control of the server that could update all the POS system. So that's why they actually um install the malware on all the POS system through the server. So this is a diagram showing this. If an attacker actually sends malicious commands to this firewall control server, and if the hacker successfully control this, then these commands will actually be able to be propagated to all the other firewalls and then take control of this software. So this becomes a single point of takeover, or of course it could be a single point of failure. So we also need to mention the concept of least permissions in access control. So access control is very important to basically is to set control on what each user can access to. So if attackers cannot get access to a resource, they cannot exploit it. So as you mentioned, access control is limiting who may have access to each resource and limit his or her permissions when using the resource. So we should not give permissions to users who do not need to do certain things, right? So we need to set the permissions carefully. A lot of times, people are lazy, right? Just give everyone the administrator role and then can do anything. But then when you are doing this, of course, it's very convenient for, say, for the users, right? They can do anything when they need to, but they will also be very dangerous because um, wherever any of these user account is compromised, then the hacker actually will have access to all the administrative rights. So we also need to talk about the concept of authentication versus authorization. Now, sometimes people get confused between these two terms. Authentication is really about the proof of identity. That means I'm trying to verify whether you are the person that you claim you are. Right? So I verify your identity. Then authorization is usually the permissions that a particular user is given with a resource. So that means after I have verified your identity, then I will let you do what you are supposed to do. Then what you are allowed to do. Then you are allowed to access the files in your own folder, but you are not going to be allowed to access the data of another user, right? So you are authorized to do some of the work and also see some of the data, right? But you may not be allowed to, for example, change any files on the website, right? Or see the data of other users, right? So just because a user is authenticated does not mean that he or she will be permitted to do everything, right? So this part is about the authorization. That I know who you are, and you are only allowed to see your own data or do certain operations, but not everything. So that's the difference between authentication and authorization. So again, then when we talk about authorization, then we will try to follow the principle of least permissions. So we'll give each authenticated user only the minimum permissions he or she needs to do his or her job. So of course we cannot allow the user to do unauthorized things that will compromise security. So again, don't be too lazy in doing that. Try to be um, careful when giving users permissions to do different things or access different data. So there are some examples of limited permissions. A user may be able to create files but not delete files, or maybe cannot see files above a certain level of sensitivity. So in some organizations, you may define the level of sensitivity for different data. For example, sales data may be less sensitive, but then you are talking about personnel data, the salary of employees, or some other personal data um, in an organization, then those may be at a higher level of sensitivity, or even like email contents or some trade secrets, and these are even higher level of sensitivity. Then different users may have different level of access to these different levels of data. And then some users may be allowed to only read files but not edit the files, maybe able to see files in their own folders but not all the folders, maybe able to connect to that person's department server but not the other servers, or do certain things but not give others permission to do them. So you can do these things yourself, but you cannot grant any permissions to any other users. So a lot of organizations are doing what we call the policy-based security. So planners create policies and these specify what to do, but not how to do it. So these are the basically what about what to do. So and then the policymakers will create policies with the global knowledge. Right? And then when it comes to implementation, then the implementers will implement the policies with local and technical expertise. Then usually this one is kind of more like when you are talking about some of the international or multinational organizations, then you have some more like global policy on how to handle like this kind of different security, right? Especially as we talk about a lot of these are related to the processes, right? So how these like the planners will kind of give us some high level policies on what should be done, right? Then then those who are implementing the policies sometimes will implement with some like um, kind of different variations in different locations. So that's why you have some local expertise there. Of course, like those who are implementing it are usually having more technical knowledge, so they will know how to do it. So here are some policy example. So for example, the high level policy is strong encryption should be used for credit card data. And then when it comes to implementation, then the employees, probably the security experts, we need to choose a specific encryption method like within this policy. So which encryption method you are going to use? Is it strong enough? And so on. And then you will select where in the process to do the encryption. It should be encrypted like on the I don't know on the client computer before the client even send the data to you, or um, you encrypt it when you store it into a database, or like what where it should happen, when and where it should happen. So you need to decide on that, right? Of course, some of them may work, some of them may not work. Right? Some of them may be more secure, and then some of them may be less secure. Then you have to like select where to do it. So you also need to choose good options for the encryption method. Even if you have selected method, then there are different options, right? For example, how many bits are you going to use for the key and things like that. Right? So these are the implementation details that should be decided by the ones who are going to implement the policy. So sometimes there's one more layer like on the implementation guidance. You set up the standards and guidelines for the implementation. So implementation guideline goes beyond purely what by constraining some extent the how. Right? For example, you may specify that encryption keys must be more than 100 bits long. Right? So when you have these constraints or some these kind of standards and guidelines, basically they will constrain the implementers so that they will make reasonable choices. So at least you specify to a certain extent how it can be done. So implementation guideline has two forms, as we said. There are standards that must be followed by the implementers, and there are also guidelines. So guidelines normally should be followed, but are optional. However, guidelines must be considered carefully. So another example of standards versus guidelines. So for example, if I say you require 128-bit encryption, then it's kind of like a standard that you must follow. So say requiring security staff members should have 3 years of security work experience. So that's also something you should follow. So, but it maybe it's very difficult for you to make sure you follow, right? So because it said it should have rather than must have, right? So normally like then we will call it like a guideline. But again, in a lot of organizations, you still try your best to follow all these guidelines. So guidelines are used for situations that are not amenable to black and white rules. So then when we're doing this kind of policy-based security, the oversight checks that policies are being implemented successfully. Right. So then there will be some like various oversight check that involve like auditing, log files, also vulnerability analysis. So then all these basically will allow the organization to analyze where these policies have been successfully implemented by the different, for example, different location offices in different locations or different subsidiaries and so on. So good implementation plus good oversight, and hopefully then you will have good protection. So there are different forms of oversight, like as we said, auditing. So it's an audit there were some sample actions taken within the firm to ensure that policies are being implemented properly. So they will track different things. They will check for example the software that you are using to look at your procedures. Basically is really to look at your processes and look at your implementation to see whether it's correctly done. And then they will also read log files to see some of the network log files to see whether the network traffic is really what you describe is whether and also whether they are really following the policy. And also a lot of these information system auditor, they will also run vulnerability tests, try to attack the system before the attackers do. So they will run some software to try to attack your system and then see whether it can hack into a system or not, right? So they will try different way to do that to find out whether there are any vulnerabilities that could be fixed before the attackers exploit them. Policies are usually given to implementers and oversight staff independently. So they are not given at the same time. Then and also the implementation staff do not work with the oversight staff together, such that they are doing it independently. Then by doing this, oversight actually may uncover some implementation problems or problems with the specification of the policy, right? So they will be able to find out problems, and then they can improve the implementation with their findings. So finally, in this chapter, we'll talk about centralized management. So one way to actually manage, one important tool to manage the network is to use what we call ping, which sometimes we call it the oldest network visibility tool. So probably many of you have used this before, and we also do this in our tutorial. So ping is basically you send a message to an IP address and ask for a reply. So for example, network administrator can actually ping the different devices or hosts on the network. So ping this one with the IP address 10.1.2.3, and then see whether it's getting any reply. And then it's pinging this firewall server and getting no reply. Getting this IP address that is not running, and no reply. And also playing this computer, no reply, and so on. So then normally when a computer is on the network, then it should provide a reply, right? And then depending on what it's doing, then actually when your network administrator is running this, you can know which server or which device is running and which devices or servers are not running. So you always try to ping your own computer or just ping any website or an IP address. Right? So for example, this one is an example of pinging Google. Right? So you ping www.google.com. Right? You just type this ping with the IP address or the URL. Right? Then if it's successful, then you get the reply. So it will give you the IP address where it's replying from the byte of the ping message and the time, right? So it's how many milliseconds and so on. So then you also have the statistics: 4 packets sent, 4 received, so there's 0% loss. Also the approximate round trip time in milliseconds, so there's average is 7 milliseconds. So this is a diagram showing a little bit more about how this works. So step 1 is you ping someone, and then we go through like different devices again on your network. Could be hub, could be switches, before it goes to the router. And then when it's reaching the router, that is on the internet, right? And again, it may be working with other route. It may further send a message to other routers until it goes to the recipient, and then it will send back the reply. So sometimes people call it ping pong, right? So that's why it's called ping, and then the reply is called pong. So ping can determine if a host or router is reachable. However, it is actually better to know even more information. I want to know whether it's working properly, whether what its status is. So is actually desirable to have better network visibility by knowing the status of all devices at all times. So to do this, there is a protocol that was designed. So it's called the Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP. So it was designed to collect extensive information needed for network visibility. So most network operation centers use more powerful network visualization product based on SNMP. So SNMP is a protocol, but then based on that, then there are many different softwares. So some of them are very powerful. So in SNMP, so the central manager program communicates with each managed device, like switches, routers, or servers, or just user computer and the PCs, and so on. So actually, the manager communicates with a network management agent on each device. So more technically speaking, is talking with a little software on each device. It's called the agent that is running on each device. For example, this one is a switch, and on the switch there is an agent that is particularly dealing with network management. So kind of you can imagine it as a small software or process running on that device that is following the SNMP, and then it will communicate with the with the manager. The manager will send the SNMP commands and gets SNMP responses, and then the NOC constantly collects data from the managed device using this protocol, using more specifically SNMP get commands. So it places the data in the management information base. So the diagram is like this. So again, the manager is communicating with this agent software on the device, and then when it wants to know something, it will send a get command, right? And then it will respond with the data. Right. And then if I want to change some setting, I can also use the set command. And normally the agent only responds to command, but if there are some alerts, you can also send a message using the trap process. So the manager can send set commands to the switches and also other devices within the network. Then usually an agent only responds to commands, but then when needed, it can also send a trap message if there is a problem. So network visualization programs take results from the MIB, the Management Information Base. Basically, it's just you can think of it as a small database storing all the data and of the different devices. So there are some visualization programs that can take results from the MIB and then interpret the data to display results in map, or sometimes like in different types of graphs, and then you can also find root causes for problems and also do other tasks, right? So when you are managing a network, you may probably see this kind of visualization, kind of like a dashboard for you to look at the status of your network, right? Whether the traffic and the speeds are okay, so whether there is any latency and so on. So SNMP interactions are standardized, right, because it's based on the protocol. But as we said, there are many different network software that will be doing different visualization and also different program functionalities. Right, so that's why you have different developers that have developed different software, right, that have different functionalities based on the protocols. Of course, as a network administrator, then you'll be able to choose which one you want to use. Some are more powerful and more expensive, some are relatively cheaper. So many other network management tasks can also be automated to reduce the amount of work that network managers need to spend on details. For example, a lot of times you want to install some standard corporate configuration, you want to change some configuration on the network devices or install patches, instead of having to like manually go to each of the device and do the installation. Most of the time you can do this through your central network management software through the manager. So you can automate this kind of configurations and also patch installation easily, without physically going to the device or without connecting to the device one by one. You can do it through the manager. In the last few slides here, we'll talk about firewall management. So traditionally, for firewall, need to set a lot of things for firewall forwarding. So how we are going to forward the individual frames or packets. So we'll talk more about that in later chapters. And then we also have firewall control, which is for creating the rules for firewall forwarding. So what packets should be forwarded and what should not, and where they should be forwarded to. So this actually have to be set manually. So traditionally, all these different devices actually you have to do manual configuration, and usually this one is very time consuming. That especially you may have a lot of different switches or routers or access point. They all require many of these manual configuration from the network administrators. So for cloud server farms where you have a lot servers, and then you may actually let people use them as virtual machines. It's actually very important to ensure the virtual machines for different customers cannot talk to each other through the site's local area network. That is, forwarding rules may have to change each time the cloud service provider spawns a new virtual machine. Now, of course, if you have to change it every time, then actually it's very difficult for you to do it manually. So the good news is we also have something called software defined networking control. That means instead of doing all this setting manually, you can actually have this what we call the SDN, like software defined networking SDN controller, that actually will be able to control all the send the commands to all the different devices that are SDN compatible. Then the SDN actually separates the network device forwarding function from the control function. Also place the control function in an SDN controller. So when you're doing that, then actually it will be much easier for the administrator to do all the settings. And then it will be like defined based on software, right? You do not have to change the setting manually. Right? A lot of times the software can change it based on what happens. And so finally, we will talk a bit about centralized firewall management. So for example, the firewall administrator can send policy to a firewall policy server. So you have a server that is particularly dealing with all the policies for the different firewalls. So for example, you may have a policy like this. Any non-accounting IP address may access any external web server. Right, so that's kind of one rule that you can put. But then you may have other rules saying like accounting IP address then cannot access any external web server except for some sites. Right, so we have different policies. Then you install them on the policy server, and they will be communicated to the different firewalls. So all these firewall specific rules will be communicated to the different firewalls based on the policy. For example, this one is in accounting, right? So it's not non-accounting, right? So this accounting cannot access any external server. Maybe this non-accounting, so this can access the external server. And this one is the border firewall, so we also need to know because it's about external web server access. So that's all we want to cover in this chapter. Thank you very much. See you next time.